Well, welcome. I'm Rod Swerman. I've been a maple producer for 20-some years. Been a winemaker for a lot longer than that. I started making wine when I was a teenager. My parents knew about it, but still, I think I made my first batch of wine at 16. It was a fruit wine. I don't remember if it was blackberry, strawberry, rhubarb. But the first batch was kind of like, not so good. But by the time about the third batch, I kind of figured out what I needed to do and kind of been intermittent with it ever since. And picked up home brewing in 1991 because I was living in a place where I couldn't find the beer I wanted. So you turn up making it yourself, and so I've gotten into that. Now I'm doing cider, I've done mead, and ciders, meads, anyway. But you think about maple wine, don't think of maple wine, there's some legal issues you have to concern yourself with. Your idea of using syrup as an outlet for syrup to sell the wine, you're going to have to go through a whole bunch of state and federal licensing, BATF, IRS and all that kind of stuff. But the permitting for a winery to sell wine is pretty intensive. I think of where I work part-time at a winery now, and I think of what they went through and what I've been told about the permitting they had to fight through to get that off the ground. But as a home winemaker, home beer maker, you can make, under the Homebrew Act of 1978, I think it was, you can make 50 gallons per person or 100 gallons per household. That's a lot to make for yourself, but you can't sell it. That's the one caveat of the whole thing with homebrew and home winemaking, cider, mead, everything. You can't sell it. And you don't believe how many times people have come to me, can I buy a bottle of your wine? Can I buy some of your beer? No, can't do it.
Can you give it away?
Can you gift it?
You can gift it away, and we do that all the time.
Can you accept donations?
You get into a gray area. Because the homebrew club, or the beer festivals down in La Crosse are nice enough that they let our homebrew club come in and treat us as a brewery. But they can't pay us for our beer. Most of the vendors, when they go to a beer festival or a wine festival, whatever, the vendors and the breweries get paid for the beer that they bring and serve. But as the homebrew club, they can't pay us. But they do there's some gray area thing where they treat us all as volunteers, and basically we all get free admission. Most brewers can only come in with 2 or 3 people to work their booth, but they let us in with 10 to 12. But at the same time, a bunch of us that are not working the booth, you end up working security on the grounds, making sure everybody's pouring the 2-ounce pour, whatever it is for the day at a particular festival, or making sure people aren't being overserved, if they're intoxicated, that you find officers or whatever and have these people escorted out. So you're protecting the safety of the whole grounds and everybody there to make sure everybody has a good time and things don't get out of hand. So we help a lot in that way. And they do give us a little stipend for that, but that all doesn't go to us individually, it goes to a club, for a club for other projects and such things. But anyway, think about wine, would be making maple wine be an outlet for substandard syrup? I think that kind of thought comes up to some people, well, this is something else we can make with it and maybe use syrup that might have defect. The answer is no. Because the old adage still applies like if you're a winemaker. You can't make good wine out of bad grapes, but you can make bad wine out of good grapes. So you can't make, same thing, you can't make good maple wine out of bad maple syrup. It's like with anything, with beer, with ingredients, and anything that you ferment. You can't make good meat out of bad honey, kind of thing. So don't think of it as that. Again, you can't sell it. If you want to go anything else, you're going to need the winery license to produce it and sell it. That's why we're working on a project here with the winery that I work at. We're working at a project to commercially make one that we can bring in to the international conference and serve with our Taste of Wisconsin dinner or at one of the banquets. But ramping it up from the homebrew recipe or the homemade recipe that I've got there to a commercial scale and everything that they have to deal with has been a challenge. And I think that's some of what you've heard, that it's not the easiest thing to ferment. You got to treat it like mead. You look at the recipe I've got here. This is a tried and true recipe. I've made a couple of very good batches of maple wine with this recipe. And you think about this recipe is a mix 4 gallons. Then it starts with a gallon of good syrup. Use good syrup. I find dark amber works the best because when it ferments, you lose 2 grades. It'll go from dark amber to light. But you think of where's all the color and flavor in maple syrup? It's all tied to the caramelized sugars. But what happens when you ferment? Sugar molecules become alcohol molecules. All the color and flavor attachments to these caramelized sugar molecules, they drop to the bottom of the bucket. So you're left with this very light straw-colored liquid that has got a very delicate maple flavor. But to do that, you look at all the different list of additives. I've got the bentonite, yeast nutrient, yeast energizer, acid blend. You've got to control or manage the pH to give it a nice balance. The energizer nutrients is like fermenting mead. Mead does not want to ferment because it's almost too pure of a sugar. Well, maple syrup can be that way too. You do have some trace minerals which are good for yeast health and yeast activity. But the yeast energizer and the yeast nutrient, well, even at the winery I work at, they talk about the yeast nutrient. They call that like yeast crack. It's basically ammonium nitrate. It's a nitrate that you add, and it really fuels the healthy yeast. And a healthy yeast will give you more of a straight, clean alcohol versus fusels. Because if yeast is stressed when it ferments, it produces like side alcohols. They call them fusels. They can have really weird flavors, where you get esters and some aldehydes and different things. But the healthier you can keep the yeast, at least from the time you would sprinkle, the part where it talks about sprinkling the yeast on top, to till the time it starts actually bubbling and converting sugars to alcohols, is very critical in there. And you want the yeast to be as healthy as you can make them. That's why some of these additions are in here to kind of cover up the deficiencies in maple syrup as a base sugar to ferment. Now maple syrup, I don't know if you want to do this a lot, but being a maple producer, I've got access to the syrup, so I can play. Now I lost my train of thought. But otherwise, if you had to go buy the syrup to do it, it could be a very spendy wine kit. So by the time you put all the pieces together, that's why I say you don't want to use substandard syrup. Use the best syrup you can. The other thing that's on there too is the maltodextrin. That's another trick I just learned that helps give it body and mouthfeel without adding to the sweetness too much. Because when you eat maple syrup, you can expect that feeling in your mouth and your palate. There's a little viscosity and body and thickness to it. And the expectation is with maple wine, you don't really want it to be watery and thin. You want it to have a little bit of stickiness on your palate. So I use the maltodextrin because now the concern is gluten. The original recipe, actually I used some grain I borrowed from my brewing side. And I added the body with a grain called dextrin, or a Carapilz malt. I would steep that grain because a lot of those sugars are very complex and they don't ferment. But it adds a lot of body and mouthfeel and kind of roundness to it. But you got to be concerned if there's gluten problems, the celiac thing. So I kind of went with the dextrin. But I tell you what, the one with the grain, yeah. But you have to be careful who you share. That's the thing. And the idea is to do a test batch before we played with the one at the winery. Can we make one that's got the right body and mouthfeel? Because I don't know that you want to induce grain or a gluten threat into a commercial winery. Right now everything's there, you don't have to worry. So do we want to mess? So we had to come up with something that would give the body, because you know what it turned out. Beautiful. There's one other thing I wanted to add up front.
Rod, where would you get that?
That's the stuff on the back. A lot of these, on the back I've got a list of some of the homebrew and home winemaking supply shops that I commonly use. And I put a little few notes about each one of them there. That was the other question. Who has actually got any winemaking experience?
My wife played with song.
No, because I say, this is not a recipe to tackle or a wine to tackle as your first try. I guess the assumption I make is that somebody's got some basic understanding of winemaking principles. What you have to do, setting up, equipment needs. The other thing is if you're not familiar with the winemaking, like I say, this is not the one recipe to dive into for a first try. Just being honest with you. But there are several good beginner books out there. And I was looking on, I've got a few at home, but I found there's even actually one called Winemaking for Dummies. One of those black and yellow books, that whole dummy series that they've got for everybody. Well, they actually have one that's for winemaking. I don't have that one. I'm curious to see what's in it though. I might pick it up if I can find it. I might actually grab one for myself and something to read through to see what they actually have to say. But then I go through a little bit of a basic recipe process in here. The pectic enzyme, I add a little bit of pectic enzyme to it, because maybe it ties to that. Remember you were to ask me, I can't think of her name here, Beaner's wife.
Connie?
You had said something about, when we were chatting before we started, about the filters plugging up and something with the adding back. I wonder if the pectic enzyme, I don't know if they used it or not, but I do in mine, and it helps, I think it seems to help the clarity later.
Yeah, I used it in fruit wine.
But it's optional, it's not one of those things you really have to do. But the basic winemaking, a basic winemaking kit of those places on the back there, or visit your local homebrew supply shop. Most bigger cities in Wisconsin, like Eau Claire, Wausau, Green Bay, should all have a local homebrew supply shop. And winemaking, homebrew and winemaking kind of go together, they sell both. I mean, we've got one or two even in La Crosse, Madison's got them, Milwaukee, but even some of your smaller towns, I think, actually have them
We
too.
have one. Sometimes, like your wine shop, just the corner wine shop guy, he had a lot of the supplies in there.
A few things, yeah, but doesn't have the complete stuff.
No,
A lot
he
of these ones I gave on the back have got a very complete,
Yeah, because I go to Eau Claire when I have to do that.
yeah.
Stevens Point's got a nice one.
Yeah, Stevens Point does, and like you say, you said Rice Lake's getting one. What's the other little town I'm thinking of? There's another little town down in east central Wisconsin. It's got a pretty nice shop too. Or like I say, you can go online, and I make some notes of the ones that I either try to go local if I can, but sometimes they don't always have everything you want, especially after you've been at it long enough and you want to diversify what you've done and try a new style or try something different. You got to search broader to find just different ingredients or different equipment you need. The other thing I found too is I've got different sets of equipment for beer, for wine, for syrup, because you worry about that cross-contamination thing, with the celiac and the grains. So I've got a whole separate pile of equipment for brewing and a separate pile of equipment for winemaking. But if you're just going to do wine, you only need the one set. But having been involved with all of it for too long, my wife's kind of not happy with me having too many hobbies and too much equipment. And it seems like it never ends once you get started. But the basic, the recipe I've got here starts with a gallon of syrup, and you find that, syrup is 66 bricks. The best wine I find is you dilute the syrup down to 21 or 22 bricks. That will give you a wine at the end, because maple syrup is 100% fermentable. It will take it to complete dryness. So then you've got to deal with that in another step, which is an additional step that sometimes you don't have to deal with in some of the most simple winemaking, where you just make a simple dry white or a simple dry red. That step doesn't come in. But if I have 4 quarts of syrup, we'll give you a 4-gallon batch, and I use what I usually make with this. You can scale it up or down, but the bentonite helps clarification at the end. The dextrins for the body to add in. Good clean water is important. No chlorine. If your city tap water's got chlorine, you probably got to search for a different source of water. Chlorine is the enemy of any fermented beverage. You don't want chlorine in your beer water, any of it, because chlorine is a weird molecule. And like you said with the chlorine for the RO, bad, chlorine bad if you ever get contaminated, because it'll actually kind of half ferment and start mixing with the molecules in the fermentation and give you some really weird flavors. So avoid, the other thing is you can take your city tap water and boil it the day before and drive that chlorine off. I know people that do that, but I've got a well, or a lot of times now I'll bring home 5-gallon cube containers of water from the winery because they'll let me do it. And I like using their water, they've got good water. Avoid distilled water though, because you do want the trace minerals. That's one of the things that make yeast happy. That's one of the good things with maple syrup, because you still have the trace minerals in it. Even if you've got cloudy syrup that's not fully filtered, the niter that sits in the bottom or end up in the bottom of your syrup jugs or jars, That's okay, because it's, magnesium, potassium, different things that yeast will use at different levels. So that's okay, and then that'll all settle out when it's done fermenting anyway, if you make a good clear wine. Again, if you're not familiar with winemaking, I say the other thing is the beginner books talk about a lot of the sanitation and making sure all your equipment is clean to risk contamination from other microorganisms that you don't want in there, which is very easy to happen, especially until the wine is fermented. Once it's fermented out to dryness or 11–12% alcohol, there's a little bit more safety as far as having contamination, but initially when you start, you have to be very careful. And I just kind of go through my process here of, and a lot of this is fairly standard stuff, but I wrote down a little bit of stuff that's kind of specific to this recipe. There's lots of assorted wine yeasts out there. I just wrote down a couple here that I like to use with this that have performed well, make a nice clean flavored wine. Not that I'm loyal to either one of those, but they're readily available. They're little packet sachets of yeast are like 75 cents, $1 at the most. So that's a minimal expense in all of it, is getting a decent culture of yeast that will ferment and make a nice clean wine. The other thing is control fermentation temperature. I mentioned that down there, 70 to 75, but being a white wine, I might try to do it more in the fall, winter, spring, when you've got a cool basement. Keep it in the 60s if you can, like mid-60s to upper 60s fermentation temperatures. It'll be even cleaner. You start getting temperatures, especially for white wines. Getting into the mid-70s, upper 70s, you start to get a lot of these other fusels, what's the other one I was thinking, fusels, the aldehydes, and other side things that yeast ferment when they're not completely happy. Because most of your white wines, if you think of some of the best Chardonnays, the best Rieslings, that kind of stuff, they're all fermented in the 60s. Some of them even go upper 50s, if the wineries really want to play, and they got something really special they want to do. Timelines wise, I say the other thing that's kind of, to me, is kind of critical is once the gravity, because you'll make it, when you get to 22 bricks, 22 bricks is a specific gravity of like 1.085. And the hydrometer will tell you that. But when it gets down under 10, like 1.010, you rack it to secondary to get it off the sediments, you get it off the bentonite, because that doesn't completely dissolve. But it helps. Some of it goes in with the yeast. When the yeast chews through the whole thing, it gets suspended in there and helps, like I say, helps clarification when you go to that step. But you want it to, once it starts to, you'll notice the airlock will bubble fairly vigorously there for a few days, but then it'll start to slow down. And I like to do, for me, I just know my system, my house temperatures and stuff, that after about 5 days, if the ferment takes off well, using a couple packets of yeast, it will, that it takes about 5 days to really go through it. And the airlock will slow down. And usually then I'll go and put the hydrometer in it, sanitize the hydrometer, of course, test it, it'll float. It's just like your hydrometer for syrup, only it's scaled differently for water alcohol versus syrup. We don't have red lines. It's kind of an infinite scale. So it's, but somewhere between 0.10 and 1.000. I like to take it off the first batch of sediments, because they're the yeast is already starting to settle out, so you get rid of a lot of what they call the gross leaves. There's the fine leaves and the gross leaves. So you want to get it off of that. It helps keep that delicate maple flavor more intact. If you let it sit on there too long, there's a secondary process that starts to occur. And you start to get, sometimes you can start to get very earthy notes, or yeasty notes and earthy notes will come in. And so you try to minimize that, especially in delicate white wines. So I like to do that right away. And a lot of the wine kits, if you want to start making wine with a simple wine kit, a lot of the local shops, your local homebrew shop, or those online retailers will have simple wine kits you can start that are, if you follow the instructions that come with them, they're fairly bulletproof. You can make a decent batch of wine the first time out. But at least what it does, and you can get a decent little wine kit, for as much as little as $50 to $65 to make something that's like in an Arbor Mist class of a type thing, or a simple Riesling, or a simple Merlot kind of thing. One of my favorite ones that I started out with was an Arbor Mist kind of thing. It was a raspberry dragon fruit Shiraz. I still make it every once in a while because I just love it. And if you take it anywhere, everybody else likes it too. But I can get the whole kit, I get the kit for like 50, 60 bucks.
You make 4 or 5 gallons, so.
You make 6 gallons. This one makes 4 only because I started out with a gallon of syrup. And what it takes to dilute it to a proper fermentation range to give me the, because I sat there one night and back calculated everything. If I'm gonna do this, how much, you know, if a gallon of syrup, how many gallons of wine is gonna give me, and I sat and figured it out. And sure enough, you start doing it all, and then you put the hydrometer in it, and said, wow. You can calculate it, and okay, the first one's 11.5%, right where I wanted it. That makes a nice balanced wine, especially for the maple. You don't want it too weak, but you don't want it too alcoholic either, because the flavors are delicate. You start getting over 13%, you're gonna get a, what we call a hot alcohol burn, especially if you stress the yeast. And sometimes they'll call it rocket fuel, which a lot of guys, if you've ever, first time I made mead, I had read a good book on mead making, and that's very susceptible to the rocket fuel hot alcohol, because the mead in the nature of honey has got very little of the nutrients that yeast want to ferment well. So all weird things happen. You get all the fusels and the not diacetyl, but esters and different things come in. So you got to keep the yeast really happy. And what you end up doing with a mead is you feed it nutrient like every 2 days. You stir it up and feed it nutrient every 2 days. Keep it aerated, keep that juice pale or aerated, keep oxygen into it every once in a while, and keep fresh nutrient to it. And you can make some very clean, beautiful meads. I got one of the guys in the homebrew club makes a black currant mead that is to die for.
One of my mistakes is when I was making a red wine, and I didn't degas it. I didn't degas it. And I got the rotten egg smell.
Yeah, you can get sulfurs. And this one too, typically, you'll get a little bit of sulfur from the start, especially if you make cider.
Yeah.
Somehow apple cider and cider yeast throw a huge hit of sulfur.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll leave, but still, that's why I kind of get it off those gross leaves right away, even when I make my ciders. They only start about 1.060, 1.0, so I get an alcohol that's in the 7 to 8 range. But that's normal for a cider, a hard cider. But they throw a lot of sulfur, and as soon as it gets down like to 1.005 on the hydrometer, I will take it off the gross leaves right away. And that seems to help control the sulfur, and then you let it sit. And then you open it up, and I said the degassing is very important too. But I have noticed when this is really fresh that I will get that sulfur note too. So you gotta be aware of that. But a lot of times after you're done, it's gonna age for a while too, that goes away. In the bottle, after it's been corked in bottle, 30 days to 3 months, it'll calm down, that goes away. Even with the ciders that are just in your face sulfur sometimes.
Yeah, when I open up a bottle every once in a while, and maybe it's because I know what that smell is, I can like, it's still there. But,
Yeah, everybody's palate's different.
Yeah.
That's the thing, that's the beauty of wine. Everybody's palate picks up something different. And that's why some people like Cabernets, the next person likes Rieslings, because it's what's your palate. And you and I could taste the same wine, and it doesn't taste the same. So that's why wine is fun. Anything wrong with that? But nothing's wrong with that. That you taste this, I taste this, but what else was I going to say here? Then I go into the other thing that's critical is the last paragraph down here. It's critical with maple wine. We made sure we did this with the wine that we made at the winery. The maple wine we made with your syrup at the winery was to sweeten it back. Because you expect maple syrup is sweet, you almost expect a maple wine to be sweet. And sweeten it back, we sweeten it back with maple syrup. They weren't going to do that right away.
oh,
So, but again, we ran into a couple of little issues that we still haven't solved as to why it behaved the way it did, but it didn't matter with the flavor, it didn't matter with the clarity, it just mattered with the filtering a little bit. But it gives it more robust flavor. The color darkens back up a little bit. Again, use good dark quality, grade 3, number 3, the dark amber, you know, there's light, medium, dark, very dark. The dark seems to work best.
I noticed you added the potassium metabisulfite after you sweetened it back with the maple syrup.
No, we do that.
You've got it down here.
The potassium metabisulfite at the end is for the preservative.
Okay.
And they add that at the winery as well. And how it's basically shelf life,
yeah.
especially for white wines.
You
Red
mean
wines have got natural.
potassium sorbate. This is potassium metabisulfite.
Yep.
You added that
I
to
added
me.
both.
Yes. But I add that metabisulfite before the fermentation process starts, when I'm making fruit wines.
Yes,
This is just to get rid of bacteria that you don't want in it. That's why I'm asking, do you add, I never add it to my wine after it's fermented.
most of all of mine I added at the finish.
You do.
Yes, after I degas.
What is the reason for adding it with all the alcohol? Why would you add it?
Because it's still an antioxidant, it protects it from oxygen, and it extends the shelf life.
Oh,
Really?
Yep. And I say most, you look at any commercial bottle of wine, it says contains sulfites. That's what it is. I think some of the sulfur smell that you get out of young whites or the young maple wine is the potassium metabisulfite that's added at the beginning. Yeah,
Will
you
it
see,
stay with it? That,
the yeast will pick it up and carry it through a little bit, but then when you degas, a lot of it gets driven off when it's degassed. Because it's, I don't know if it's actually tied to the sugars a little bit, but it doesn't tie to the alcohol molecules. But yeah, with a lot of fruit wines, when I make apple cider, when I make hard cider, I make a blackberry wine or a raspberry wine or something with fruit. Yeah, because you use it to effectively sanitize
exactly.
your
Get
fruit.
rid of
Because you don't know what
bacteria.
kind of wild yeasts are on the
Yeah.
blackberries, what kind of wild yeasts are on the strawberries.
But you add so little, like I think I had a 1/4 teaspoon to
Yep.
5 gallons at the, before fermentation.
But the maple syrup, if you pull it out of a sealed jug, it's been sealed and it's been stored, it was hot packed at 200 degrees and it's sealed and it should be sterile.
Yeah.
So I don't really worry about it. That's why you use
Oh,
good clean
okay.
water, sanitize all your equipment, good clean water. And if you follow the recipe there, you don't have to wait that 24 hours to pitch the yeast. Because usually when you do the fruit wines, you wait
Oh, you bet.
24 to 48 hours to
Kills
let
the-
that
Kills the yeast.
metabisulfite kill the yeast and kind of neutralize itself
Yeah.
in the mix and kind of get
Yeah.
used up. So that the yeast that you pitch into it will actually ferment it healthily.
yeah.
Is that the right word?
Yeah.
But,
Halfway.
but again, at the end, you use it as a preservative. And I like to, my whites, I like to dose them a little heavy at the end because I like my whites to last a couple of years. Because I don't go, now that I work at a winery, I don't drink a lot of homemade wine anymore. So I've been,
Don't have
I'm
time.
having stuff age up.
Yeah.
And speaking of aging out, one of the very first batches of this maple wine I made when I used the grain was 2012. I've still got 2 bottles of it left. The last time I tried one, it was phenomenal.
Pretty good.
See, mine
I took a bottle of
is
young maple wine, it was a year-old, and I took the bottle of 9-year-old to a brew club meeting. The guys preferred the old one. And I poured it for everybody here, give me some feedback. And they loved the 9-year-old one, because it had kind of morphed into, it had the kind of a nice warm maple flavor, but it had kind of aged into a sherry. So it had the sherry note to it. And it had come just, as I say, but again, the metabisulfite at the end helps protect that. It gives it some bottle shelf life.
And is that why then you wait a month to bottle? Because you've added that, see, like I
Well,
will,
the other thing is the metabisulfite, the potassium sorbate, the sweetening back, and the clarification, I kind of all do that on the same day. It's one step. But then I don't force filter anything. I let gravity do the work. And every once in a while, and once you with the dual fine or the what was the other one? The dual fine or the super clear. They're basically the same thing. There's a Kysistol, if I'm saying that right, and a Ketosan.
Yeah,
Couple of things. You put one in and then you wait an hour and put the other one in. And I did that with a wine just the other day. And it kind of coagulates all the suspended proteins and all the other suspended solids. And by the time I had finished, in a matter of 30 minutes, the wine had pretty much cleared. They are really effective. But I usually like to sit and wait 3 or 4 weeks, because every once in a while, about once a week, I'll go in there and I'll grab the carboy and give it a twist
I do
shake,
it too.
because the sediment likes to stick to the walls,
Yep.
and you get it all to the bottom. So I just time, and usually I'm never in a hurry.
see, I usually, when I sweeten it back, man, we're on the road to bottling.
Yeah, but I give it time to clear. 30 days is usually time,
Okay,
and that's a typical standard kind of wait time with any commercial wine kit.
But I run mine through a filter.
Yeah, you feel, I don't.
Yeah.
Because the small batch, I'm too afraid
Yeah.
of oxidation. I transfer everything because of all my brewing. I've got CO2 tanks and vessels and stuff that I can purge the oxygen out of them with CO2.
Oh, wow.
So I can transfer everything under CO2, so I have minimal risk of oxidation. When I rack from primary to secondary, it's under CO2 blanket, and when I do a lot of this with the degassing, we're going to be driving CO2 out of it, so you're not too much of a problem there. But when you sweeten it back, and different, even when I bottle, I hook my CO2 tanks up and I've got a bottling wand, or a counter pressure bottle filler thing for brewing, but I'll shoot the bottles full of CO2 before I siphon the wine into them. And then I cork them, then I hit them again, and then I cork them. You'd be surprised, it really helps.
Get that oxygen out of there, right?
Keep all the oxygen,
Yeah. Oh,
especially
yeah.
with these delicate whites. Well, the other thing too is with the sweetening back. I can use the real maple syrup, and I dose at half a pound of syrup per gallon. So 2 pounds of maple syrup to sweeten back. It gives me 4% residual sugar in that 4-gallon batch, which gives you a semi-sweet to sweet wine. Again, you could add more if you wanted sweeter, but that's just,
For taste.
I'm not sure was there residual sugar on the running tree wine?
No, I didn't,
I don't remember seeing
I'd
that.
have to look at, next time I work, I'll have to look and find the recipe sheets and see, and ask them what they did. Because I've got 1 bottle of yours left
yeah.
in my cooler, and I've got one next to mine. I'm gonna brown bag them both, take them to a brew club meeting one night, we're gonna blind taste them, to see if anybody can pick out the difference, because the one I made, like 6 months before they made the one at the winery, and the running tree one, I have a hard time picking out a difference. They're both just beautiful if you like a nice, delicate, semi-sweet maple one.
Yeah,
The only thing I know that was different is mine's like 11.5% alcohol, that one was 9.5.
Yeah,
yeah,
because we said that was only nice.
yeah.
But I think one of the important things is to sweeten it back with maple syrup, because it gives you a more maple flavor, because you'd be surprised, you lose 2 color grades when it ferments, you lose probably about 80% of the flavor. Because like I say, a lot of that flavor is tied to those caramelized sugars that are no longer sugars. And they say things don't stick to alcohol molecules like they'll stick to sugar molecules. So the yeast just kind of, I was surprised how much color loss there was. Even when, we use the dark amber syrup in the recipe there, and how light the wine comes out. But it's even lighter if they don't sweeten it back with maple syrup. That's why they had to go get a second barrel of syrup. Because they were gonna just do it with,
Well, Beaner would have had kittens if he wanted to sweeten it back with
He
maple
would've.
syrup. He would have just, put sugar in maple stuff.
no. And I say, that's one of them where I got the winners.
Yeah.
They listened to me. And so it was well received, and it sounds like it was well received by everybody.
You bet it
who came to
was.
I'm just
Yeah.
hoping the next batch
Yes.
turns out for the international,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
that it turns out just as good. Well, actually, I intended this to be questions and answers, and I'm sitting up here rambling, so. Anybody have any questions?
Have you made maple beer?
Oh, that was on there too, maple beer. I've not made it's hard to make, you can't make a straight maple beer. But I have made beers where I've added maple syrup to them, and there's some tricks to that too. I find it either works best in secondary, after the primary ferment is over, and you take it off the gross sediments, rack it over, and then I'll add syrup per the recipe I'm working with. It usually works best in darker beers. Kind of comes off as a nuance, but most palates will pick it up. But if you do it in secondary, it doesn't ferment so hot and fast, and you don't drive off a lot of the aromatics from the maple that stay in there, because it ferments slower. Really helps. And then sometimes I know one brewer down there, he's doing it, he adds the potassium sorbate to the beer. Because he makes a lot of what's called pastry stouts. Or milk stouts and stuff, where they're the sweeter stouts, the big sweet stouts that have got graham cracker in them or marshmallow. He made one that was called Waffle Iron. And it tasted like you're eating breakfast. You're having waffles and coffee breakfast with maple. And it was absolutely wonderful. But he stabilizes it, he neutralizes the yeast with the potassium sorbate, so it doesn't re-ferment. And then he adds the maple syrup into what would be tertiary. And then adds his other coffee extract or cold steep coffee goes in, and different things to give the flavors that he wants. So,
The editor of our local paper in Medford is a brewmaster, and he made maple strawberry beer, and it was awesome.
All second
Really,
that.
really good. Yes, that's right, you tasted it at our
A couple
open house.
times.
It
but
was.
I'm guessing he probably did something like that too, where he hit it with the potassium sorbate, and then added the strawberries, added the maple, and let that kind of infuse into there for a week, or maybe 2 weeks, and filtered it out or settled it out, and then bottled it so you can preserve those flavors of the berries and the flavor of the maple. But again, maple syrup is 100% fermentable. So if you want to preserve the most of its flavor in a beer, you've got to kind of put it in, but you don't let it ferment. Otherwise, all you're going to do is add it and boost the alcohol, which, depending on the beer style, is probably what you don't want.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing that's what they did there. The other thing I do is in the little thing they wrote up about me, I put maple syrup in small bourbon barrels, rye barrels, rum barrels for barrel aging syrup. I usually do the syrup goes in hot, and I usually put the syrup up to like a 67 or 68 Brix, because what's going on in there, the syrup being so high in sugar, but it doesn't, if you get, especially, and it works best with fresh dump barrels, within a week or two. It takes the devil's cut back out of the wood. That's why you get such that rich, almost chocolatey, vanilla, oak flavor out of a bourbon barrel or rye barrel syrup, depending on what spirit was in the barrel, because it's pulling out that devil's cut. Which, with the small barrels too, depending on the size, the quality of the barrel and how good a barrel you got, once that process is done, you'll notice the barrels will start to weep, especially around the heads, the ring around the heads of the barrels. It usually tells you that it's done. But most of the barrels I've got, I'm working with a brewer, and we coordinate when they've got a beer ready, or coordinate when I dump, take the syrup out of the barrel, and I'll take the syrup out in the morning, he's got a beer in it in the afternoon. You run less, I'll pull the syrup out and bung it right away, and get it to them, and then they put the beer in right away, so you don't have contamination, because if you leave a maple syrup barrel sit, it will start to get bacteria and stuff can grow in there. And I've had a brewer tell me that they've had bad experiences with barrels that they bought them from some barrel dealer, but they might have been emptied for a month, and he lost a batch of beer in one. It's sour and lactobacillus and all the other things that we don't want as microorganisms, contaminating things, got to it. So now I'm working with brewers when I give them to them. I have the beer ready, this is an estimated date, we'll coordinate, and that's what we do. They're happy, I'm happy.
That's gotta be quite an experience doing the bourbon barrels, because a friend of ours wanted to do it. He bought the barrel, brought it out to our sugar house, we filled it with syrup, and it just sat there. Pretty soon, it was seeping through the barrel, and we were like, oh my gosh, this is really bad, it's seeping through the barrel. Talking to Rod yesterday, you said, yes, that happens, you gotta wet that barrel down.
Yeah, and I usually store them, I usually keep them out in the garage where it's a little bit more damp, but I'll watch the barrels, and if they start to weep, I roll them, I got them on little roller dollies, I'll just roll them out on the driveway and hit them with a garden hose, maybe wait 10-15 minutes, hit them again, let it start to wet that wood up from the outside again, but then I've got clear plastic bags that I've accumulated, and I tent them with a clear plastic bag to help control the humidity, keep the outside of that barrel somewhat moist. Both barrels are white oak. White oak is kind of naturally rot resistant to microorganisms, just because the acidity of the wood and other tannins that are in the wood. And, it doesn't really want to mold or rot in a barrel form, so you don't have to worry about that even with a little bit of moisture. But even with the bag I've got on there, the moisture soaks into the wood, and the barrels quit weeping again. But once they start weeping, I've got maybe 2 to 4 weeks before I gotta coordinate getting the syrup out. And with a 5-gallon barrel, if you put the syrup in hot, realistically, you probably only needs to be in there 30 days. For a small barrel, 10-gallon, a couple months to 3 months, 15-gallon, 3 months to extract most of that flavor. Just from my experience with the different sizes and when they start to weep, that you pulled most of that devil's cut out of the wood. But now, as soon as they put a beer back in, beer is 90%, 95% water again, with only 5% alcohol, no sugars, or a little bit of sugar, and some of the moisture will go back in the wood and seal the barrel up from the inside again, instead of drying it out from the inside when the syrup pulls all the water out of it.
So when you do your bourbon barrel syrups, when you heat that back up to package it, when you're finished, do you go right back to the original hydrometer reading?
I will get it
Original
back,
syrup?
I will get it back because,
Or do you
Coming out of
bottle it up a little lower to save some of that alcohol?
no, I get it
Let the alcohol
back.
all steam
Because
off it.
I'll put it in the barrel at 67 to 68, because I know my experience says it's gonna lose 2 points. And when I come bring it out of the barrel, it's like 65 and a half, it's usually shy of 66.
10 minutes.
All right.
Yeah, that's
So-
what we've noticed too. So I wanted you to steam that off again and get it back to where you
Yeah,
put it in at. That's
what
what
you
we've
do-
normally done.
You lose the alcohol,
Right,
but you don't lose the flavors.
okay.
It makes your kitchen smell really good when you do it.
Well, yeah, you put your
but
head in
all
that
of-
steam, it'll,
Most of that flavor stays in there, but I get it back to 66 bricks.
okay,
Just 66, 66 and a half, because it's a little bit inexact. But I make sure I got 66 because it's legally syrup.
right.
And you get over 66, it's the water activity thing they were talking about with all the safety, food spoilage stuff, and you know.
Right, but is that actually water then, or is it just reading that much lower because of the alcohol that's left in, is what I was
It's
wondering.
pulled out of the barrel. I think it's a combination of both water, because when spirits are put in barrels, they're put in at 60 proof, or 60%, like 120 proof.
Yep,
So that means there's 80 proof of water, so it's 60% alcohol, 40% water. And that's what gets pulled into it. And so when you reheat it up to recheck your density and before you actually bottle it for sale or whatever you do with it,
yep,
you're driving that water that pulls out of the barrel. But again, all the other flavor compounds stay behind.
sure.
So yeah, it's,
Yeah, cause we've done the bourbon barrel stuff for about 3 years, and we had a wheat whiskey barrel, and I thought, well, I wonder what happened if, you know, we know the syrup went in at the right density, so if it's reading light, is that just alcohol, and what'll happen if we just bottle it there, even though it's reading about 2 points light? And it tasted, I mean, it tastes really good, but we just did it about 4 months ago, so we haven't, you know, yet to see if
thing is,
we'll have any spoil issues with it.
the alcohol in it is gonna be something less than 0.5%.
Right,
And is that enough to prevent spoilage?
right, that's what I was wondering.
My gut feeling, I don't know, but my gut feeling says no.
Okay. So far, we haven't noticed anything, any of them had mold on or anything like
No,
that.
I haven't, with the stuff in the barrels, I've got a bourbon barrel that's had syrup in it for 3 years. Only because the beer I wanna put in it, I haven't taken the time to brew the beer to put in it. And the barrel, it's been a little 5-gallon, but it hasn't weeped. It has never weeped. Don't know why, just really, I got lucky on that one. But most of them, after a set amount of time, they'll start to leak a little bit. That they've pulled most of the devil's cut out of the wood, and it's time to take the syrup out and fill it up with beer or maybe a cider, whatever. Ooh, I wonder if a maple barrel H&B.
Yeah, we did a bourbon barrel stout kit just from Northern Brewery,
Yep.
right after we dumped it. It was pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah, you can get totally creative when you got access to some of this stuff.
Yeah.
I started barreling syrups, so I could have the barrels to put beers in. You know, because I love barrel-aged beers. I mean, that's my go-to style.
Yep.
So, any other questions from over here? I mean, if you want to do this, it's a little bit of an adventure. I'm sure they've got my email addresses on the WSPA website, so if anybody tries it, has got questions, just fire me an email, I'll get back to you. But it's not something that's, you know, by the time if you don't have the equipment already, you know, a good basic winemaking equipment kit, it's gonna run you about $125 to $150 for the carboys and the fermenters and all the other little gadgets that you need. But it's one of those things that's like, sometimes it's like making maple syrup. Once the bug bites you, you can't get it out of you.
Yeah,
Yeah, so,
that's winemaking. I had learned from a fella that was almost 80 years old, he had made wine for 50 years. He said, if I can't make wine, I don't want to live anymore. And he did, he made wine right up to the last day he
well,
was
some
still
of it's the
making
same
wine.
thing as you've got with making maple syrup. It's creative control. You can make what you want, to your style, to your tasting, to your liking. Or if you want to make a batch as a special gift for friends.
I did
That's
it for
always
my daughter for her wedding.
Hmm?
I made wine for my daughter's wedding.
Oh, fun.
It was kinda cool.
To say you did it, it makes a special gift.
I think
Sure.
our apple wine was homemade, but then I did like, 2 kit wines, and it went over well.
Mhm.
The beauty of it, the more they drink, the less they know about the taste.
I mean, I've made beers for graduation parties, I've made beers, special beers for retirement parties, special beers for weddings,
Yeah.
not what's the reception, not the one beforehand, the dinner.
Oh, yeah.
The, yeah, the
Rehearsal.
rehearsal. Yeah,
Yeah.
I made it for stuff like that, and people love the idea that you took the time
It's
to be
homemade.
creative and make something special for them. You know, so you got the opportunity here with the maple, because you got the access to the maple.
Yeah.
Maple, sugar and maple syrup as a fermentation ingredient is expensive. Especially if you had to go buy it, you know, buy a gallon of good syrup. And that's just the start. So, but if you make the syrup, you've already got it there, and you're not gonna miss a gallon from your inventory.
Yeah.
So that's what I do.
We'll sure be ready to sample this when we're at the international conference in October.
I'm probably gonna make another batch myself, and we'll be able to do a side-by-side again.
Oh, that would be
Bring in a
interesting.
side-by-side with a new one and the new one that they're doing.
Sure.
So,
Oh, good.
Thanks, Rod.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, very good.
Rush you, but
hopefully I didn't disillusion anybody on this,
Oh,
but it's not something you just dive into. I say, I did it because I've got all the equipment already and I've got the syrup, so I said, why not give it a try?
I worked 2 summers with this older fella too, just making wine, and he made many kinds of wine and had won many state awards too. I mean,
You're in
but-
Marshall, wasn't it?
Yes, no, in Stetsonville.
Oh, it's Stetsonville.
We belong to a wine club in Marshfield, where
Okay.
they judge wine several
Yeah.
times a year, and you take your wine down there, and it's critiqued, and it's really, you'll learn a lot, but
Mhm.
I know he stressed cleanliness, you know, make sure your equipment is clean.
Yes,
Hoses and
cleanliness
all
is
that.
next to godliness.
Yeah, yeah,
Because I say you have one batch get contaminated with something because you didn't practice good cleanliness on equipment, it frustrates you really quick.
yeah.
So I've never lost a batch of wine to spoilage. I have lost a batch or two of beer. Because something wasn't clean, something got contaminated, and the fermentation went awry, and it's like, this stuff isn't drinkable. Down the hatch, down the drain it goes. You just try to source the infection so you don't repeat it. Clean it, something had to get cleaned up on. I don't remember what the case was on a couple of them, but clean up your process somewhere and make sure you don't lose another one.
Thanks for making the maple wine at Elmaro Winery near La Crosse. They make some very fine wines, so it was very nice of
Now, it was kind of fun working with them to put that together.
Yeah.
That they kind of picked my brain a little bit for it. I gave them my recipe here to start.
Do you remember when we were at one of the fest, Maple Fest or whatever, and you and I were talking about it? Wouldn't that be neat? And then you said, well, I worked there, I'll put the bug in their ear. And I said, well, Beaner's got maple syrup.
Was it the Winter Institute? A couple?
It was quite a few years ago, so that probably was it.
No,
And then I was telling Beaner goes, well, I can donate the maple syrup for it. And I'm like, yeah.
because there's also the connection of Laura and Lanita know your
Yes.
family through the curling.
through curling,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, that was the other small world.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like, oh my God, and I was mentioning it, I've got somebody that'll donate the syrup, and I told her the name, and they're like, ah,
Yeah.
we know them
We met on the ice.
for years.
Yeah, that's right.
So, yeah, then I remember the day you were down there when we sampled it.
Yes,
And you had 6 or 7 of you were down there.
yes,
When they had the sampling day.
sampling,
We walked out on the patio.
yes,
Yeah.
sampling for sweetness.
Yeah, we were doing the sweetness trials.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what they ended up with.
I think we all liked the sweeter one. It
Yeah.
just seemed
Yeah.
like we all agreed on the sweeter one.
That's the expectation, the syrup is sweet.
Yeah. And we happen to like sweet wine, so there you are.
And so do most people.
Yeah,
So you make what people like.
sure. Very good.
So even for a sweet wine, I'm more of a dry wine drinker myself, but I'll drink the sweet maple.
Yeah.